So you just missed the review. I forgot the microphone again. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, "Lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see I give to you and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants like the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants could also be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I will give it to you." Then Abram moved his tent and went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord. Now, that last verse there we read, verse 18, I'm going to start with that one because it gives us some geography. We'll talk about the geography and the trees. It says that after God blessed him, Abram and his family moved to the terebinth trees of Mamre in Hebron and built an altar. So first, let's talk about Hebron. Hebron is probably the second most important city in ancient Judea, after only Jerusalem. And that's because it was the capital of Judea for a long time until the middle of David's reign. Hebron was the capital until David captured and rebuilt Jerusalem. But Abram was the first Semite to live there, and this would become the main city of the Hebrews until David captured Jerusalem. It was also David's home base for his first 7 years as king. And in Hebron were buried Sarah, Abraham, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Leah. They were all buried in the same cave that Abram bought from Hebron in Genesis chapter 23, which we'll get to eventually. Hebron was the highest town in in Judea, at about 3,000 feet. It was higher than Jerusalem even, so you can see farther from Hebron than you can even from Jerusalem. Maybe Abram liked that spot because he could see all the land that God had promised to his descendants. Now, clearly it says he camped near a grove of trees called terebinths. Now, if you've never heard of terebinth, that's the Hebrew word for oak. So basically it means it was giant oak trees there. At the time, Hebron was a strong walled city. And we know that because in chapter 23, when Abram buys the cave from the people there, we're told that he met and made the deal with the city elders sitting in the gate. You only find gates in walled cities. So it was a strong city meant to protect itself against enemies. Now, one interesting question is, why would the Canaanites allow Abram to live near their city, and in fact, in one of the nicest spots near the town with shady trees? Shady trees are always a really popular spot in a hot country like Judea. But remember, Abram has more than 1,000 people in his caravan, and over 300 of them are soldiers, and he is filthy rich. So towns generally like to have filthy rich people living near them, because what does it mean for the town? It means Abram's going to be buying all of their food and all of their brassware and all of their silverware and cloth. So it's an economic thing. It's just like inviting Google to move to Eureka. It's supposed to bring us huge economic benefits. So they let Abram live there because he's rich, but also because he's peaceful. He's already been living in the land for a few years, and he never harmed any of those Perizzites. Remember, I told you the Perizzites were probably not a tribe. It was probably a nickname for the wanderers who raised the cattle for the cities, because you can't really raise cattle in cities too well. There's nothing for them to eat. So the Perizzites were scouring the hills and competing with Abram and Lot for food, and yet Abram and Lot never attacked them. So they figure he's rich and he's peaceful. Now, he may be a little weird. He only believes in one God. You know, what kind of moron would only believe in one God? But he's nice enough, so they let him live there. And remember also that God blesses those who bless Abram and curses those who curse Abram. So even if they don't know about that curse, they probably notice that wherever Abram goes, people get rich. So we'd like to have him around. So that's why he's living under the trees near Hebron. He's got a walled city nearby, and he's friends with them, and he's got a place to buy all his fruits and vegetables, because all he's got is meat on the hoof. So in Genesis 18, Abram will still be living there under the oaks of Mamre outside of Hebron, and that's where Jesus and two angels are going to meet him at his tent. He's got his tent camped under the oak trees there, and that's where Jesus will come and meet them and tell them that they're soon going to have a son, and Sarah laughs. Now, one point of interest is from ancient Jewish prophecy. This is not in the Bible, and I do not believe it is true. However, it's very interesting, and it comes up a lot these days. There's an ancient Jewish legend that says when the last giant oak tree on Mamre's hill dies, the Antichrist will be born. Now, the problem there is that there have been many giant oaks in the region, and most of them died long ago. But the most ancient ones died from pilgrims and tourists. Whenever they would go to the Holy Land, they would chip off a piece of bark or cut off a piece to take home and say, "Look, I was at the Oaks of Mamre." So most of the trees died because of tourists. But one survived into the 20th century in a monastery, a Russian Orthodox monastery. Now, it was 20 to 25 feet tall and it had wide branches and provided a lot of shade. But in 1996, the Palestinians took over the region and they drove away all the Christians who had guarded and protected the tree. And so the tree died. So it's dead, except for a few sprigs that they planted from the acorns that it dropped. The whole tree collapsed in 2019, but the tree died in 1996. So there are a lot of people online who claim that this prophecy may have been met. Maybe the Antichrist was born in 1996. It's one of those dispensationalist newspaper biblical revelations. So at any rate, if he was born in 1997, then he's in his 30s now. So he'll be a young guy, if that's the truth. But anyway, having talked about the location of Hebron and the oak trees, now let us study God's new promise to Abram, which was in verses 14 and 15. And the Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, "Lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and your descendants forever." Now, in many cases, God comes to Abram when he builds an altar, and probably Abram is praying. He makes a sacrifice and he's praying to God. But in this case, it's different. It sounds like God talked to him without him even building an altar and asking. God says to him, or here's an interesting question: how did God talk to Abram? Was it just a voice in his head? We're told that it came from the Lord and not for himself, so it was not self-initiated, and it was not a vision. So I think that Abram actually heard a voice, heard it out loud, just as God had also spoken with Moses a few hundred years later. He spoke with a real voice. And it sounds like Jesus chose to speak to Abraham this time for a specific reason. It says it happened immediately after Lot and his group left for Sodom. Now, there's many speculations. Why would the Lord speak a new blessing to Abram when Lot left? Now, some say that it was because Abram was disobedient and God told him to leave all his family behind. And so God's not talking to him because he's angry at Abram for bringing Lot along. Well, that's silly because God has spoken to Abram at least 2 or 3 times while Lot was with him. So no, it's not that God is giving Abram the silent treatment and now is talking to him because Lot's gone. That's really a legalistic sort of a view, as if God only blesses Abram when Abram is righteous. But God blessed Abram even when he was unrighteous in Egypt. So that argument fails. I think the reason Jesus is now comforting Abram again is because perhaps Abram thought of Lot as a possible heir. You remember that Eliezer of Damascus, Abram's faithful servant, is currently Abram's heir because Abram has no kids. And perhaps he didn't choose Lot right away because Lot has no sons. He's only got daughters. And so that's just pushing back the problem to another generation. You need to have male heirs. But maybe Abram hoped that Lot would still have sons, or maybe Lot would prove righteous and worthy of taking over the family. Perhaps it was even a test when Abram asked Lot, "Do you want to take the good land or the bad land?" to see what he would do and see if he would be right about it. But he wasn't. He was evil. So perhaps that's another explanation. So now that Lot has gone to Sodom, Abram can no longer hope on him being the heir. He's not good enough for my family. So Jesus now comes to reassure Abram that the promise is still good, and Lot had nothing to do with it. So Lot is gone, and God still has the same plan. That's what Jesus is reassuring Abram about. Now, the normal modern Christian interpretation of this blessing is the dispensational version, which says that God is here promising the Jewish nation all of the Middle East lands forever. Now, this is what we call, or what I call at least, hyperliteralism. Dispensational hermeneutics, that's their method of biblical interpretation, teaches that everything in the Bible is literally true unless there is proof that it is meant as a metaphor. So in other words, guilty until proven innocent. Everything is literal unless you prove it to beyond the shadow of a doubt that it's not literal. Otherwise, it's definitely literal. So they only take a spiritual interpretation when it cannot be possibly otherwise. So the only times they will take anything figuratively are verses like the trees clapping their hands in the Psalms. Obviously, trees don't have hands, they don't clap hands. So that's a spiritual one, but that's about it. You can find very few spiritual meanings from dispensationalists. They're even doing linguistic gymnastics to make the weirdest pieces of revelation into literal truths. That's how you get these fictional book series like the Left Behind series by Tim LaHaye, where there are small, literal, tiny demons with little crowns on their heads going around stabbing people and shrieking. That's literal. That's going to happen. That's what they believe, that that's a literal thing. The promise here made by Jesus to Abram, though, is made to him and his descendants. All the land he can see will belong to him and them. I want you to notice that this is a change. In the first blessing in Genesis 12:7, God promised, "To your offspring I will give this land." In other words, all of your descendants are going to inherit this land, but you're not. That's what that meant, basically. But now in chapter 13, Jesus says the promise is to you and your offspring. Now Abram's involved too. He's going to get the land. That is a big change. Abraham himself will be involved in the land grab in the Middle East. So when does this promise begin? Did it begin at that very moment when Jesus promised it? No, obviously not. Not in any literal sense, because Abram doesn't own 1 square inch of Judea or the Middle East. He's just a wanderer, and they're letting him camp under the oaks. He doesn't own them. Nor does he have any descendants to inherit the land. So this promise cannot be for that moment, at least literally. Jesus is asking for Abram's faith that this will come to pass someday. So when? Turn over to Joshua chapter 1. I have some of these references up on the board. Joshua chapter 1 is one potential place where it might get fulfilled. Joshua 1, verses 2 through 4. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, therefore, go over the Jordan, you and all these people, to the land which I am giving them, the children of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given you, as I said to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, and all the lands of the Hittites, and to the great sea, toward the going down of the sun, all this will be your territory. Okay, so does this fulfill the promise to Abraham? No, not quite. Joshua is again promised the land and yet has not taken it. He hasn't taken it yet. So what about at the end of Joshua? Has he taken it then? No. Joshua conquers all the big armies and all the big cities, and they never fulfill it all. He tells the tribes, you guys go and you take out the rest of the enemies, and the tribes never did it. And also, notice that he promised all the way through Lebanon and through the lands of the Hittites. The Hittites lived in Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey. Joshua and his armies never went that far. So, once again, this promise is not fulfilled. All of the land does not go to the Jews. Even during the rulers of the Maccabees, they never took all that land. So for this reason, dispensationalists push this to a future, literal 1,000-year millennium, when Jesus will rule all of the Middle East in a glorious age of peace and prosperity, just to fulfill this promise to Abram and Moses and Joshua. So in other words, they're correct. It has not been fulfilled yet. So their answer is to say, okay, it will be fulfilled when there's a literal 1,000-year reign in the millennium of Jesus. And I say, no, it's better to forget the Middle East entirely. Just make it the new earth. Dispensationalists can't do that because they believe there are two different peoples of God. There's the Jews who are God's people, and there's the church who are God's people. And you can never mix God's promises to Jews with God's promises to Gentiles. So God still owes the Jews the Middle East, and he'll give the Christians all the rest of the world. That's not the way it's supposed to work. It's nonsense. The promises, according to Paul, are to Abram's seed, the people of faith. It's the family of faith, not genetic Jews, who are the children of Abraham. That's what John the Baptist also said. God could raise up rocks into genetic Jews. It's the obedient lovers of God who are the true children of Abraham. So turn over to Romans. We're going to look at two passages in Romans that tell us this. Starting with Romans 2, verses 28 and 29. Romans 2, 28 and 29. For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, Nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh. No, he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that in the heart, in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but from God. In other words, Jews from Israel are not Jews unless they are Christians, or they are not children of faith. They are not children of Abraham. Now, we do not believe that the Gentile church has replaced the Jews. We became the people of God, just as some godly Jews were long the people of God. So we are a fulfillment of prophecy. We are not just a new addition to it. Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians are one people. They are not different. They never were different, and they never will be different. There will not be Jews living in the Middle East while Christians live in Turkey and Europe and the United States. We will all share the new heavens and the new earth together. So now turn over to Romans 10, verses 10 through 13. Romans 10, 10 through 13. For with the heart one believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. For the scripture says, whoever believes on him will not be put to shame. There is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord over all is rich to all who call upon him. For whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. So, who are the Jews? Whoever calls on the name of the Lord to be saved. That's Christians. That is believers. That is the children of Abraham. So now go back to Genesis 13, verses 16 and 17, and we'll see this promise more specific. Genesis 13, verses 16 to 17. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants could also be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I will give it to you. So the promise of God here is a long-term promise. It's not going to be accomplished in a few generations. This number of people who will descend from Abram sounds like millions or even billions. That would be the true total of believers throughout history, not just genetic Jews. Will the total number of genetic Semites ever be like the dust of the earth in number? Maybe, but not at anything like the number of the children of God who have been, are now, and will be saved before the judgment day. So it makes much more sense to have the promise of all believers being the children of Abraham than it does to have a couple of Jews in Israel being the children of Abraham. Lastly, Jesus says that Abram can walk around all this region and believe in faith that it will belong to him. All this land will be given to Abram. Now, Abram is going to die, and all he has done in Genesis 23 is bought a cave. All he owns is a cave to bury his bones in, his wife's bones. So, is this promise made only to Abram's descendants in the distant future? No, the promise was made to Abram himself. So what does that mean? Did God lie since Abram never owned all the land? Of course not. It means that Abram will live again. This is not his only lifetime. He will have an eternal lifetime in a resurrection body. Jesus even says this directly in the Gospels about Abram. It's in Mark chapter 12, if you turn over to Mark chapter 12. The Sadducees are trying to trap Jesus with a trick question, and it's a stupid, convoluted question about a woman whose husbands kept dying. So they say, which of the 7 men who married her will live with her in heaven? And here's Jesus' reply in Mark 12, verses 26 and 27. But concerning the dead that they rise, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the burning bush passage, how God said to him, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. You are therefore greatly mistaken. Jesus points out that what God said to Moses is that I am the God of Abraham, not I was the God of Abraham until he died. He continued to be the God of Abraham even hundreds of years after Abram died. That means that Abram was still alive when Moses was alive, hundreds of years later. And Jesus spoke similarly in Matthew 8:11. I'll just read it to you. And I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. And what does that mean? It means that Abram will still be alive when the new earth comes. So these promises to Abram for many children and for lots of land are not going to be fulfilled until the judgment day. There is no need for a literal 1,000-year millennium to fulfill God's promises to Jews. All of those promises are meant to be understood as spiritual and eternal promises. The people of God will inherit the earth, not just Jews. Jesus said in the Beatitudes that meek shall inherit the earth. Do you suppose that only Jews have ever been meek? Are there no meek people anywhere on earth but Jews because they're going to inherit the earth? Of course not. There are lots of meek people who are not genetically Jewish. And is the book of Revelation only written to Jews? No. Turn over to Revelation, our last passage, Revelation 5, verses 9 and 10. Revelation 5, 9 and 10. And they sang a new song, saying, "You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain. You have redeemed us to God by your blood out of every tribe and tongue and people and nation. And you have made us kings and priests to our God, and we shall reign on the earth." So the promise that they're singing about is that Jesus made every people on earth, that's Christians, into kings and priests who will reign on the earth, which means that it is not just Jews reigning on the earth. It's all Christians who are reigning on the earth. So all of these passages are to show you that the promise to Abram was not just to Abram, it was to us as well. We, the Christians, will inherit the earth as kings and priests under Jesus Christ. So are we taking away Abram's land? No, because we are Abram's children through faith. So Abram is our great-great-great-grandfather also, and we will reign on the earth with him forever. Let's pray. Dear Lord, help us to understand your words and understand what you meant by these promises, that they're somewhat different than they may have heard on the radio or on TV, that we, in fact, are the children of Abraham, and you will give us the earth in the end. In your name we pray. Amen. Okay. We are finished, and it appears to have worked.
John, well, I see what you're talking about on the long term.